Alright, so we are going to start from a new substance scene, and before we start, I'm going to explain everything we're going to do into substance, but I'm taking for granted that you already know the theory behind the PBR workflow, at least the basic one, because we're going to use the physical basic render workflow to create our texture, and then we're going to use it also to render inside Redshift. So let's go to File and create a new scene. For the template, we want to select the PBR metallic roughness, and for the file, we want to point it to the mesh we just exported from Houdini. For the resolution, we want to set it as 4096. It's just one texture for our scene, it won't matter if it's a 4K one. For the normal map, we want to set it to OpenGL, is the one that Redshift uses, and we don't want to auto-unwrap the mesh. We created our UV inside Houdini, and let's click OK. So here's our mesh, and by default you should have a different layout as mine, so I will quickly reset the UV. So now it should be exactly like yours, and I like to close the asset for now, and I want to move the properties on the left. So on the right I just have my layers and my texture set list. Now to navigate into Substance, press the Alt button, and with the left, middle and right click of your mouse you can navigate your viewport. With the Shift and the right click, if you drag to left and right, you can actually rotate your environment. So you can move your light and see how your material react to it. And as you can see, Substance has recognized the three different material we set in Houdini. So now we have, if we hide it, we have the front material. And by the way, it's normal that you don't see the back face in Substance. We have the side material, and we have the emission, which is the plane behind the main surface. Now, before we start to create our texture, we actually need to bake our mesh map, because Substance is able to create a lot of different effects like edge wearing, occluded dirt, but in order to do it, it needs access to some information of your mesh, like the position in the 3D space, the curvature, or the world space normal, so we need to create those. And to do it, we need to go to Textures Settings and click on Bake Mesh Map. Here we have all the settings we need to change, and on the common one we want to change the output size to 4096 like our project resolution, and we want to leave everything else as it is. And let's see, we want to create normal and world space normal. We don't need an ID map. We definitely want an ambient occlusion and a curvature, and on the curvature maybe increase the secondary rays to 64. We also want a position map, and we don't need the thickness. These other ones are already turned off, so leave it as it is, and click on Bake Selected Texture. Now give it time to generate the maps, and it will do it for every texture set. Alright, so now we can click to return to painting mode, and to view those bake mesh map, as you can see here it says material. We can switch to the different channel, or if you scroll below you can access to the bake mesh map. So let's say we want to see the curvature, and it seems to be some issue with the curvature, I guess. Let me just go on the display setting. I want to see the wireframe of my mesh. Yeah, no, there's something wrong happening here. So let's quickly hop back into Houdini. Let's see what's gone wrong. Yeah, something happened with the bevel, and I believe that's my punishment for not being procedural, because I manually select the edge to bevel. Let's fix it. This bevel was the outer one, so we want it here. And 3. Let's press enter. Let's go on the final merge. Now it should be okay. It seems so, so let's save our mesh again and back into Substance. If you want to replace your mesh, you need to go to Edit, Project Configuration, and we want to re-import the mesh, leave all the other setting as it is. So now we need to bake our mesh map again because our mesh has changed. So let's click here and also make sure, yeah, I didn't change the setting for all the texture sets. So we set the emission matte, and now let's click on this little icon here and let's say apply selection to all texture set. This should, yeah, enable and disable the map we don't need, and also apply all settings to all texture set. This should copy the different values. Yeah, in this case was just the 64 for the curvature map. Now we can back the texture again, so let's click here. Alright, return to painting mode. Now let me disable the wireframe. And if you press C, you will switch from the different channel. If you press B, you will switch from the different bake mesh map. So here we have workspace normal, the ambient occlusion, and the curvature. And now it seems okay. On the front and the side, we still have those maps which I generated the first time by mistake. So I will delete the ID map and also on the side one. Also the thickness. Alright, so now we have our back mesh map and we are ready to start to create our texture. So let's press M to see our material again and go back on the layer. Let's delete this empty layer. We will start from the front material and we want to establish some base value. So let's create a fill layer. And I just realized I missed an important thing. Right now we are seeing the viewport as sRGB. And back in Houdini we were working in open color aces. So we need to set that before we move on. So let's back to Edit and Project Configuration. In here, open the Color Management tab. And instead of Legacy, we want to set it to Open Color IO. Or if you don't want to use ACES, leave it as legacy, it's all up to you. And I still use ACES 1.0.3, so I will set to this and I will say OK. So now here in the properties we have a base color, an height, a roughness, a metallic and a normal channel. We can disable the normal channel by turning off here, because we are going to use the height map and export it as a normal map inside Houdini. For the height map, let's leave it at 0 for now. We want to establish some base color, something like in the bluish, something like this. We want to be more polished, so let's lower the roughness. Let's say something like this, and we want this to be a metal. Now, one key concept of the PBR workflow is to differentiate whenever you have a metal surface or a non-metal one, because to put it very simple, the lights react in a different way on a metal surface, so the color information, all the reflection you have behave in a different way. And basically Substance already know how to behave, and you just need to follow certain guidelines. But the key is to tell him where the surface is metal or not, and you do it with the metallic channel. If it's a metal, set it to 1, if it's a not metal, set it to 0. So we want this to be metal, so we want to be a full 1, and now you can see that it reacts to light in a very different way. So this will be good as our base value, so we will rename this layer to base. Now we're going to stack a lot more layer on top of it to create an interesting material. So now we want to start to add some variation to the color and the roughness. Now I've seen a lot of different ways to work in Substance, but the way I prefer to create details is by creating a new fill layer. So let's say we want to add some red spots to this object. So we created a red layer, and we want to right click and say add black mask. So basically just like in Photoshop, we created a black mask, so the whole layer is hidden now. And now we want to introduce some effect to this mask, so we can bring some of this red back. To do that, select the mask and click on this little magic wand icon, And here you have all the things you can add to one mask. For now, let's add a fill layer. By default, you will have a grayscale uniform color, so if you set it to black, the layer will be hidden. If you set it to white, it will be full visible. The thing is, we don't want to use a uniform color, we don't want to use something like a noise. So by going in Windows, View, and click on Asset, you open the asset view of Substance. These are all the assets that comes already with Substance. And if we go on the texture tab, let's say we want to use this dirt one, so we drag it on the grayscale. And as you can see, the noise is driving what are we seeing from that layer. If you alt and click on the mask, you have that mask view, like says over here, mask. So we are kind of seeing what will be revealed by this mask, so the white part basically. So again, we create a fill layer with a black mask and then we add effect to the mask to bring the layer back. And this will be the main way how we'll create all the details we need for this object. So let's delete this layer and create the real one now. So new fill layer here, let's call it variation 1 and maybe just pin this asset window somewhere so we can have it available as we need. For the variation, we just want to be on the color and the roughness, so we disable height, metal and normal. And for the base color, we want something lighter, let's say something like this, and a little more rough, so we increase the roughness to 0.4 and something like this. Now, right click, add black mask, and here we want to add the noises we need to bring this layer back. So with the mask selected, and I'm saying with the mask selected because if you have the layer selected and you click here and say like add fill, the fill will be added to the layer itself, not the mask. So make sure you have the mask selected and we click on add fill. So now we alt click on the mask so we can see it. And let's see, we want to add like this cloud too. So drag it on the grayscale and now we can see it. But we want it to be very light, so let's decrease the overall opacity to 10. As you can see, for each effect you're adding to the mask, you have the blending mode and the opacity also. Now we want to add another one, so let's add another fill. And this one, maybe we can use this cloud one. And since it's covering the underneath clouds too, we want to change the blend mode. So let's set it to linear dodge, which is basically your standard head mode. And we want to lower also this opacity. So as you can see, we are adding more and more variation to it. Let's press M to see in the material and you can start to see some minor variation. Maybe we want to increase the contrast on the first cloud, so let's say 0.3 something, and we want to add another fill, and this time we want to use this dirt too. For this one we want to set it also to add and lower the opacity to, let's say, 13 also. And here on the noise parameter, maybe we want to increase the scaling, let's say 4, so it will be very small spots. And also for all of this node, we don't want to use the UV projection because we have cut the seams here, so make sure that every effect we are going to use is using this triplanar projection. So let's change it for every effect we added. So now maybe on the dirt 2, let's decrease the scale of the noise back to 3, for it was too much of a small value. And for the cloud one, we want to go on the tiling parameter and maybe increase it to 2.4. So we are increasing the tiling just for this cloud one. So let's hit M and we have our first layer of variations. Now we want to create another level of variation, so select the first one, let's hit Ctrl C and Ctrl V to duplicate it. Maybe hide the first one for a second, and let's call this other 2. Now for this one, we don't want to affect the color, we just want to add some variation to the roughness, so let's disable the color. And on the mask, let's delete this effect, we're going to create new ones. So click on this icon again and say add fill. This time we want to use this fractal zoom base, so let's drag it on the grayscale channel and let's see the mask. Maybe we can decrease the balance of it a little bit, let's say like this. And now we don't want to add another fill, we want to add levels. So let's hit add levels, and the levels work the same way they do in Photoshop. So you have the minimum and maximum input and also the gamma in the middle. Now we want to increase the gamma until we have a very subtle effect for this variation. Something like this. And now we want to add another fill layer on top. Let's see some dirt. Let's use this dirt 4. So let's drag it here. We want to set it to add mode. And we want to lower the opacity by a lot. Let's set it to something like 10. Here we can increase the balance of it a little bit and maybe also the contrast, so we have something like this. And we can even leave it as UV projection, doesn't matter. So we added some variation just to the roughness. Combined with the previous layer, we have this. Not so much for now, we will add a lot more as we move on. Now let's start to add some wearing effect on this object, and we want to add the first one just on the concave part of our mesh. So let's create a new fill layer, let's call it wear 01, and we want this to be a variation for the color, for the roughness, but also for the metal, because this wearing might be some accumulated dust or dirt, so it's covering our metal shader. So for the color, we want a darker value, always in the blue range. Let's say something like this. We want to be even more rough than before, so let's say 0.67 something. And for the metal, of course, we want it to be 0 because this won't be metal anymore. So now let's right click and add our black mask, but this time we don't want to add a fill layer, we want to use a generator. So let's choose add generator. And if you click on the generator here, you have all the generators available inside Substance. And by the way, the asset you see here are the same you have on the main window asset, but as you can see, they already come with some filters on the search bar, so it will show you only the effect available for this kind of layer. Let's say instead of a generator, we have a fill layer like before. If you click here, you have the same asset, but you are filtering only the effect available for a fill layer. So let's delete it again and bring back a generator. And we want to use a dirt. And as you can see, by default is already doing a lot. So let's alt click and see what this mask is doing. You have a bunch of parameters, as you can see on the left, and below we have the mesh map we baked before. Basically, the generator are those effects I was talking before when I was saying that without some mesh map they wouldn't work correctly, because this is basically adding dirt on some part of the mesh, let's say the curvature one, as you can see it, and without the mesh map, Substance won't be able to tell how to set this mask. So for the parameter itself, let's lower this dirt level, and maybe we want to increase the grunge amount so we can start to introduce some wearing effect on the border, maybe a little more. Something like this. So if we press M and go back to our material, we can start to see some dirt on the concave part of the mesh. And also if you zoom like on the corners, you can see that it's not adding dirt here, and that's because of this edge masking. So if we put it back to 0, we are getting dirt also on the corner of our mesh. Alright, that's enough for the first wearing effect. Now we want to create another one. Let's create a fill layer and call it edge wear. Here we will create the wearing effect for the convex part of our mesh. So right click, create a black mask, click here and add a generator to it. This time we want to add this mask editor generator, which is a very powerful generator Substance has to offer. So let's alt click to visualize the mask, and let's see, we want to increase the balance, something like this, and also the contrast a lot. Now here we have the curvature option, so we want to increase the curvature opacity to a full value of 1 and open the curvature tab. So here we have all the individual parameters and we want to take only the corners. So basically we want to decrease all the values except the small feature. So let's say something like this. Now of course it's too neat for a edge wearing effect, but if you scroll up here you can see that you have the texture opacity. Right now if you increase it, it basically just shrink your selection. This is because it's taking as reference this texture tab. So let's say we want to use some noise like this cloud tree. We drop it down to the texture. And now if we increase the texture opacity, basically we are distorting the mask we created with that texture value. And we also have the individual control. So let's see how to tweak it. I would say I want to increase this scale by a lot, something like 8 point something. Maybe the contrast a little bit, not too much. And we want to increase also the brightness. And also we want to decrease the global contrast now. So let's lower it, let's say to 0.2. So we have something like this, and we will add more noise and effect to it, but for now we want to tweak the base value for it. So let's disable the normal and the metal. This edge wearing will be like a curve effect, so it will expose the surface underneath. It will always be metal, so we don't want to overwrite with a non-metal value. So we will use color, height and roughness. So since we are carving inside the surface, we want to decrease the height by a little bit, let's say negative 0.02, something like this. And for the roughness it will be slightly higher, let's say 0.37 something. And for the color we want to take maybe some lighter value, something like this. So now let's tweak the mask even more. Let's look for some part like here. Let's alt click to visualize the mask, and we want to add this time a filter, which is another kind of effect you can add to a mask or a layer. Now click on filter and we want to add this blur slope, which is a particular kind of blur that is working by blurring what's underneath but using a noise as input. So by default is using this, if you open the source parameter, is using this default noise. We want to use a custom noise, and where it says custom noise we want to use this grunge dust white. So now if we increase the intensity, is using that noise to distort what's underneath. So for the parameter we want to slightly increase the blur on the source parameter, then we can close it. And on the overall parameter we want to set the intensity divider, which is basically the final multiplier for the frequency of this kind of effect. We want to set it to 10 and we want to set it to max. The blending mode, if we increase the intensity, basically max is pushing the edge to the outer part, min is being pushed inside, and blur will be a mix mode where you go inside and outside. For this one we want to use the max parameter, so we are pushing outside with our noise, and we want to set the intensity something like this. As for the noise parameter, maybe increase the balance a little bit, not too much. and I will say it's good as it is. I have the overall shape I wanted. Now we need to mask it even more. So let's add another fill layer. For this one, we will look for some dirt map. Let's say this dirt 4 again. Let's drop it on the grayscale channel. And now if we visualize the mask, we have something like this. But if we change the mode to multiply, it will take into account only the white part that are passing from underneath, and we will have something like this. So on the parameter for the dirt itself, we want to use a triplanar projection this time, and maybe we want to increase the tiling, something like this, and also increase the balance a little bit. Let's say 0.7. So let's visualize it, and I believe this is something in the direction I was looking for. Maybe just a little bit too much in the frequency, so we can decrease the tiling to, let's try 2. Yeah, it's definitely better. And even if it doesn't look right as now, we can always tweak all the parameter we are creating, and we always need to see the resulting ratio before actually finalizing our parameters. So now we want to introduce a couple of dirt map on the overall surface. So let's create another fill layer. This time we want to affect the color and the roughness and also the metal, because it won't be metal anymore. For the base color, let's take some brownish value. Let's say something like this. And we want to increase the roughness. Let's say 0.8 something. Let's create the black mask and our fill layer. Now for the fill layer, let's visualize the mask, and we want to use another dirt. Let's say this dirt 2, and let's increase the scale. I believe 3 is fine. We want to change to triplanar projection. Now let's add another fill layer. Let's take some cloud 2. We want to change the blending mode to multiply, and for the cloud, let's set it to be triplanar. We want to lower the balance, so we are masking some of the dirt, and also increase the contrast, something like this. And maybe let's put it for a second to normal. We want to see the scale because we want to set it to a higher value, something like 7. Now put it multiply again, and if we press M, we have something like this. So we added a bunch of dirt on the surface. Let's call it dirt 01, and let's create another one. So another fill layer, let's call it dirt 02. This will be more like a scratch on the surface, so let's disable the normal, but we will turn the metal back to 1 because it scratched, so expose the surface underneath, it's always metal. Then we want to lower the height, even if for now we don't see any difference, and also change the roughness to something like 0.6. For the base color, let's say, why not something more greenish? Something like this. Now right click black mask and add a fill layer. Let's visualize the mask, and for the fill layer let's look for some grunge and also scratch. So let's see. So let's use this grunge scratch one. In here let's lower the balance, and we want to be actually the inverse, so click on true and it will invert your noise. Now we want to set it as a triplanar projection, and we want to increase the tiling by a lot. Put it to something like 10, or maybe not 10 is too much, let's say 5. So now we are noticing some tiling, but we're going to filter it. So let's add another fill layer, and let's take our cloud again. Let's see our cloud 2. As always, set it to triplanar projection, And let's put the mode to multiply. Also, we want to decrease the balance, something like 0.24. Now let's Ctrl C and Ctrl V, so we'll add another copy of these clouds. And for the second one, we want to increase the scale by a full value of 8. So basically we added one cloud with a low frequency and another one with a high frequency. So we are masking things out. I will say it should be good enough. So we have something like this. Now back on the base parameter, let's decrease the height a little bit. That's too much. Yeah, something like this. And as I said before, we still need to see the result inside Redshift.